First rule was simple: don't run. Running drew them. Sergeant Mira Solis had learned it the hard way. 11 weeks ago, when Corporal Reyes had bolted across the courtyard after the supply drop, she'd watched Reyes disappear into the white fog that had settled over the ruins of Outpost Kestrel, and she'd heard what came after. She hadn't slept for 3 days. The rule had held since then. She pressed her back against the cold concrete of the inner stairwell and listened. Outside, through the cracked window above her head, the world was very still. It was always still lately. The planet of Vorath 9 had been a colony world for 6 years before the Vari found it. And in the 17 months since the invasion, the surviving settlers had learned what stillness actually meant. It didn't mean safe. It meant the Vari were between pulses. That window of 5 to 10 minutes, when the hive signal dropped low enough that the bonded ones went dormant. Like rabbits freezing in long grass. Waiting, Mira exhaled slowly through her nose, her breath fogged in the cold air. Pulse would come back, and when it did, anything that moved would be scanned, catalogued, and hunted. She turned and looked at her squad. There were 14 of them left in the lower level of Building 7. They'd started with 22, the 4 youngest. The ones the other colonists had started calling the trainees, because their orientation period had technically never ended. Sat clustered near the emergency generator, with their knees drawn up and their packs between their feet. Ern had her eyes closed. Earth was whittling the end of a utility rod into a point for the dozenth time that week, methodical and focused. Pampum was asleep against Hoop's shoulder, and Hoop was staring at the ceiling with an expression that looked like math. Always calculating. That one. Always running angles. The older ones held the corridor. Paya stood near the blast door with the salvaged EMP disruptor in her hands, which she'd rebuilt twice from Vari components and named, with bleak humor, the Carrot. She never slept anymore. Or if she did, she slept standing. Next to her, Monet was eating something from a foil packet that had long since lost its label, chewing, methodically, eyes down. She didn't talk much. She hadn't talked much since the 17th. Mira crouched beside the comms terminal. The screen was dark, had been dark for 6 weeks, but there was a frequency she'd been trying to raise since they'd boosted the repeater array 3 days ago. With parts stripped from 2 Vari sensor pylons, she'd promised the others she'd get them out. She didn't examine that promise too closely. It kept them moving. Pulse estimate, she said quietly. Peak looked up from her wrist display. Psst, she was the only one still wearing a functioning unit. She'd switched it to passive mode so it wouldn't broadcast. 4 minutes. 3, then we wait 4, nobody argued. That was one of the other things Mira had noticed over the months. The arguing had stopped. Not because morale was high, but because everyone had become calibrated to the same frequency. Burned through fear, burned through anger, burned through grief. What was left was a kind of very quiet competence. She supposed that was what survival did to people. She wasn't sure if it was a good thing. She thought about the message they'd received 29 days ago. Burst transmission, partial, fragmented, but unmistakable in origin. A Human Alliance deep-range relay vessel, the Meridian. She decoded the carrier signal herself 3 times, in case she'd made a mistake. She hadn't. The Meridian was in system. Couldn't land. The Vari atmospheric grid would shred anything that broke the cloud ceiling. But it could hold a geosynchronous corridor if they could reach the relay point at the old northern transmitter array. 22 kilometers through occupied territory. 22 kilometers. The Vari hive pulse reached for roughly 400 meters, in all directions from each bonded unit. The bonded ones moved in loose patterns but covered ground fast on their long rear limbs. They didn't tire. She had 4 minutes between pulses to keep her people alive. "Tell me again," said a voice beside her. Pim, the youngest of the trainees. She'd come to Vorath 9 as a child with her parents, who were agronomists, and she still looked it. Slight, dark-eyed, with a habit of braiding and unbraiding the same section of her hair when she was anxious. Right now the braid was coming apart for the 3rd time in an hour. "Tell you what," Mira said, "the plan. What it looks like when it works." Mira looked at her for a moment. Outside through the slit window, something moved at the far edge of the courtyard. One of them, slow and white and wrong, its form half preserved and half not, moving in the loping not-quite gait of a Vara-bonded unit. They'd been colonists once. That was the part Mira tried not to think about. The Vari didn't kill what they absorbed. They kept it running, changed the wiring. "It looks like us getting on a ship," Mira said finally. "It looks like Hoop eating actual food that doesn't come from a packet. It looks like Ern sleeping somewhere that isn't a stairwell. That's what it looks like." Pim's braid came apart again. She started over. "And the hard part?" "The hard part is everything between here and there." Mira paused. "We've done hard things." "We've been hiding," Pim said. It wasn't accusatory, it was just exact. "We've been surviving." "Those aren't the same thing." Mira glanced up at Peak. "How long?" 1 minute. Mira stood. She unslung her plasma cutter. Not a weapon, technically, a mining tool. But in the colony's early days they'd used them for 100 tasks, and she'd had 6 months to practice different applications. She checked the charge cell. 78%. She'd needed above 40 for what she was planning. "Listen," she said. And they listened, all of them. Even the ones who looked like they weren't paying attention. "Today we start moving. We don't get to Meridian sitting here. We take the service tunnels to the outer ring. We use the pulse switch to cross between sectors, and we make for the transmitter array. We stay in windows. We stay quiet. We don't run." She paused. "Anyone who wants to argue about that can do it after we're on the ship." Nobody argued. Finished pointing her utility rod and tucked it inside her jacket. "Pulse just dropped," Peak said. Mira opened the blast door. The steer service tunnels were dark and smelled of old hydroponic nutrient solution, and something chemical and sharp she'd stopped trying to identify. They moved in a spread formation, Mira and Paya at front, Hoop watching the rear, with the others in twos between. No lights. They'd mapped the route over 3 weeks, using Vari sensor data they'd hijacked from a pylon, and they knew every jump point, what place where the tunnel crossed under a sector boundary and the pulse field overhead would be stronger. The tunnels were about 1.5 meters wide, single file where the pipes ran low, spread where they didn't. It was intimate, moving like this, in the dark with 14 people, close enough to hear each other breathe. Mira counted seconds. 4 minutes between pulses, 2 minutes inside the tunnel before the next crossing, 1 minute of margin. She moved on math, the way Hoop moved on math, the way all of them moved now. First junction passed without incident. The second, also clean. At the third junction, there was a sealed door that hadn't been sealed 3 weeks ago, and Mira stopped the column with a fist, raised and crouched to examine it. Door was a standard airlock type, rated for pressure differential but not for blast. And someone had welded a Vari sensor node to its frame. Recent work, within the last week, the weld mark still bright. She felt Paya come up beside her. They looked at the node together. "It's live," Paya said, barely moving her lips. Mira nodded once. She looked back down the line. And Ern had already fanned out to either side of the tunnel, holding the angles without being asked, which made Mira feel something she couldn't name clearly. Something close to pride, but sharper, more specific. They'd come in as trainees. They'd become something else. Mira took the small metal case from her vest pocket. Inside, the last 3 e-power charges she'd built from salvage components over the past month. Each one hand-sized, each one representing about 8 hours of work. She looked at the node. She looked at the case. She put it away, and instead reached for the multi-tool on her hip. The node ran on a Vari resonance frequency. So did every piece of Vari hardware in the colony. The frequency was the same. They'd never changed it, never varied it, because the Vari didn't expect anyone to be able to tune to it. 6 months ago, through trial and error and a lot of burned fingers, Mira had figured out how to tune to it. You didn't need to destroy the node. You needed to tell it you weren't there. She clipped a small wire coupler to the node's outer relay pin. It was in the same position on every unit. She'd verified that, and connected the other end to a bypass box she'd built from a Vari drone's navigation array. It transmitting. The node's indicator light cycled from amber to green. It thought the tunnel was empty. She stood, gave the column the hand signal for move, and they moved. The second hour was harder. They came up from the tunnels, into the ruins of the northern processing district, where the old fertilizer factory stood empty and scorched. Their roofs collapsed in geometric patterns, from the Vari atmospheric shelling in the early months. Out in the open, even at night, even in the dead air of a pulse window, you felt exposed in a way the tunnels didn't produce. The sky above Vorith 9 was low and gray with mineral haze. It was always gray now. The atmospheric processors had been offline since month 4, and the ruins cast odd shadows, long and angled. They moved in silence, pulse window 4 minutes. They crossed 3 open sectors before the count brought them to cover, behind the shell of a collapsed storage bay. Mira crouched and counted. They all counted. The pulse came back and something nearby moved. She didn't see it. She heard it, the specific soft thump drag of a bonded unit shifting weight, very close, maybe 20 meters to the east. She felt the people behind her go absolutely still, in a way that was no longer instinctive but trained. The way soldiers go still, and she was dimly grateful for that, and tried not to think about how they'd become soldiers. They waited. The bonded unit moved again, passed to their north, and eventually the sound faded. At her shoulder, let out a breath so slowly it barely registered. "Close," she said without sound. Mira looked at her watch. 11 minutes until next window. She took the foil packet out of her jacket. She always kept one there, a reflex, and split it with Pim, who was crouching next to her looking pale and very still. The food was dense and tasted of nothing in particular. Pim ate half of it with the focused obedience of someone whose body still understood. It needed calories even when fear said otherwise. Slid in beside them. "We've got a problem," she said very quietly. "We have many problems," Mira replied. "Specify." Yogurt's ankle. She came down wrong on the tunnel step. She's moving, but she's slowing. Mira didn't look over at Yogurt immediately. She processed the information first. 20 kilometers still to go. An injury that slowed the column. Vari bonded units that were pattern recognition optimized. They noticed anomalies in movement profiles. Someone limping moved wrong. "How bad?" She says. "Fine." Paya says, "Not fine, trust Paya." Mira finally looked over. Yogurt was sitting with her back against a collapsed beam, her jaw set, her eyes steady. She was 17. She'd survived 11 weeks in a bombed-out colony building, and she had the look now that they all had. The look that didn't have a name, but meant I will keep going until I can't. Mira respected it. She also knew you couldn't argue with physics. She went to Yogurt. "Give me your pack. I'm fine. You will be fine. Right now, give me your pack." Mira took it without waiting. She handed it to Keofrong, who took it without a word and redistributed her own weight. Mira crouched in front of Yogurt. "You lead the column from 2 positions back. You set the pace. If the pace needs to change, you say so. Not later, right then." Yogurt looked at her. "If the pace I need slows us down, then we're slower. We're not leaving anyone." Mira paused. "That's not negotiable." Something shifted in Yogurt's face. Not surprise, exactly. More like confirmation. Like a thing she'd been holding provisionally was now confirmed as real. She nodded once and didn't say anything else. They lost the 3rd window to a Vari patrol. 3 bonded units moving in a swept formation through the processing district in a pattern that hadn't been in the sensor data. New behavior. The Vari updated their search protocols, which meant they'd learned something. Which meant they were looking for something. Mira filed that away. It felt important. They sheltered in the ruins of an old hab unit, 6 of them, in a back room that smelled of synthcrete dust and old fabric, while Paya and Monet watched the exits. In the dark, while they waited out the patrol, Eve started humming. Not loudly, barely audible, a thread of sound. Mira didn't recognize the melody for a moment, and then she did. It was a children's song from the colony's early years. Something that had played on the settlement broadcasts in the mornings. Before the broadcasts had stopped. She didn't know when Eve had learned it. She hadn't heard it in over a year. Nobody told her to stop. Ern leaned her head back against the wall and closed her eyes. Pampum, who'd barely spoken in 2 days, pressed her shoulder against Hoops and exhaled. Mira sat with her knees up and listened to it. She thought about the meridian, holding its corridor above the cloud layer. She thought about the 20 kilometers still ahead of them, and the ankle, and the patrol pattern and the EMP charges she hadn't used yet. She thought about something she'd told her people very early on in the first weeks, when the situation had still seemed like something that might resolve itself quickly. "We are not the last." She'd meant it as reassurance then. She believed it now for different reasons. Because if they were the last, the Vari would have stopped hunting them, and they hadn't stopped, which meant there were others out there, scattered and silent, and still alive. Troll passed. The window opened. They moved. The transmitter array was visible from 2 kilometers out. 4 tall pylons against the gray sky, still standing, which surprised Mira until she understood why. The Vari hadn't destroyed them. They'd integrated them. She could see the resonance nodes mounted on each pylon, the same amber indicator lights, the same relay architecture as every other piece of captured infrastructure. She stopped the column in the ruins of a transit depot and studied the array through her monocular. "They're using it," she said. Hoop looked over her shoulder. "Using it to do what? I don't know yet." Mira lowered the monocular, but it's still transmitting. The antenna array is still functional. They've added hardware, but they haven't replaced the core array architecture. So you can still use it. I can still use it. Mira handed the monocular to Hoop. "Look at the base of the north pylon. Count the bonded units." Hoop looked, counted. 7. 7 holding a defensive perimeter, protecting it. Mira looked at the array, at the distance, at the pulse cycle timing. 7 bonded units around a defended position. 4 EMP charges, each of which would temporarily disable Vari hardware within a 12-meter radius, which would be enough to drop the pulse field locally and create windows, but not enough to take out all 7 units. And if any of them raised the alarm before she had the array transmitting, the hive would converge and it would be over. She needed something else, she thought for a long time. The others waited. That was one of the things she'd noticed about this group. They were patient, not passive. They were watching, processing, ready to move the instant she said move. But they didn't fill silence with noise. She'd known units in the Colonial Defense Corps that couldn't tolerate silence. This group had been forged in it. "Keofrang," she said. Keofrang looked up. "You can still drive the old service crawler?" Keofrang thought about it. We Master 6. "If it's still there, I can drive it." Mira nodded slowly. "A service crawler. 6-wheeled, automated, originally used for infrastructure maintenance. No transmission signature the Vari would recognize. It predated the occupation. It used pre-war power cells. It was as invisible to Vari sensors as a rock. She'd had an idea forming for 2 days, and she hadn't let herself think too hard about it in case she was wrong. But the numbers were starting to add up. She laid it out. Not quickly. She wanted them to hear it completely, to find the flaws before they committed to it. They found 2. Found one of them, which had to do with the timing of the second EMP charge in relation to the pulse cycle. Found the other, which had to do with the approach vector and a drainage channel she hadn't mapped. They talked through both, quietly, and fixed them. Then they moved out to get the crawler. The service crawler was where they'd left it. Miracle enough on its own. And Keofrang had it running in 11 minutes on a trickle charge from the backup cell. It wasn't fast, it wasn't quiet. It moved like what it was, a 6-ton maintenance vehicle, on worn suspension, grinding slowly over broken ground. They loaded it with everything they didn't need to carry by hand. Weight wasn't an issue. Noise was. Mira drove it herself for the first 100 meters to test the engine noise profile against the wind, and then handed it to Keofrang, who, it turned out, could read the ground by sight in the dark, with an accuracy that suggested she'd spent a lot of time doing exactly this. They came to the last position, 300 meters from the array perimeter, and stopped. Mira checked the pulse cycle. 3 minutes to the next window. She looked at the bonded units through the monocular, mapped their positions, confirmed they matched the plan. She looked at her squad. They were looking back at her. Not with fear. They'd burned through fear months ago. Not with bravado either. Something quieter than that. Something that was just ready. She could see it in Pia's hands, still on the carrot. In Ern's shoulders, settled back. In Pim's eyes, which were clear and steady and very young, and had no business being as steady as they were. "If this works," Hoop said. "When this works," Mira corrected. Hoop almost smiled. "When this works, I want to eat something hot. I don't care what it is, I want it to be hot." "Hot food," Mira agreed. "When we're on the meridian." "When," Hoop said, like she was learning the word. Mira took the EMP charges from the case. She handed 2 to Pia, kept 2 herself, and explained the throw points one more time. "Pia, listened without nodding. She remembered everything the first time. Then Mira looked at Kaofrang. On my mark. Kaofrang put her hands on the controls. The pulse window opened. Mark, the crawler lurched forward. Kaofrang had the engine at low throttle, just enough to move it at a walking pace. Enough noise to pull attention, not enough to trigger a chase response. Mira watched the bonded units respond exactly as she'd predicted. 4 of the 7 turned toward the crawler, which was approaching from the west, their heads tilting in the characteristic scanning posture. 3 weren't watching the west. She moved. Psst. She was already halfway across the ground when she heard Paya throw the first charge. The detonation was low. No sound, just a pressure wave, and then a soft electronic stutter as every Vari node within 12 meters lost coherence. 2 bonded units on the south side dropped out of active mode simultaneously, their motion going loose and strange, like marionettes with cut strings. Mira threw her first charge at the north pylon base. The amber indicator lights on the resonance nodes flickered. Shh. Went out. She hit the base of the pylon running, got the bypass box clipped to the relay pin before the lights had finished going out, and started the transmitter sequence. The Vari protocol layer came up on her screen. She'd studied Vari code architecture for 2 months, using logs from the pylons they'd hijacked, and it read to her now like a second language she'd never wanted to learn but had. Because there'd been no alternative, she navigated to the broadcast module and started rebuilding it from her saved configuration, hands moving fast, and she could hear behind her the sound of the remaining bonded units reorienting, could hear Paya firing suppression shots with the carrot. Not to destroy, the EMP charges did that better than any weapon, but to herd, to redirect, to buy the seconds the sequence needed. She could hear the crawler still moving. Kaofrang keeping them occupied. 80% complete. She heard Yogurt shout a warning, the clear, carrying shout of someone who'd done it before and knew what volume the situation required. And Mira didn't look up. Because looking up would cost a second, and a second was what she didn't have. She heard Earth's voice cutting across the warning. Then 2 EMP detonations, in quick succession, from Paya's position. And then for a very strange moment, there was almost no sound at all, except the wind and the hum of the transmitter array warming up. 90%. The screen threw an error. Authentication handshake required. Vari protocol secondary layer. She'd planned for this. She'd planned for it, and she'd hoped it wouldn't trigger, and it had. She reached into her vest pocket and took out the last thing in it. A small Vari data chip she'd pulled from a destroyed bonded unit 3 weeks ago, carefully, wearing salvaged insulation gloves because the chip ran warm and she hadn't been sure what was on it. She'd cracked the encryption 2 days later and found a secondary authentication key, a broadcast override, the kind of thing a Vari network administrator would carry. She still didn't know why one unit had been carrying it. She'd stopped asking why months ago and started accepting what she found. She inserted the chip. The error cleared. The transmitter completed sequence. The antenna array reoriented 30 degrees north, toward the corridor, where the meridian was holding. Mira opened the channel and keyed the Alliance emergency frequency. Meridian, this is Solis, Colony Outpost Kestrel, Vorath 9. We have 14 personnel at the northern transmitter array. Questing emergency extraction and tactical support window. Please respond. Static. Then, from very far away, crackly with atmospheric interference and the distance of nearly 2 months of silence, a voice. Kestrel, this is Meridian. We have your signal. Stand by. She closed her eyes for 1 second, just one. Then she opened them, because there was still work to do. The remaining bonded units had regrouped. Pulse would come back in 90 seconds. And when it did, the array's nodes would re-authenticate, and it would be over. She needed to hold it longer. She needed to go back into the code. She spent 2 months studying Vari architecture, and she'd learned enough to navigate it. And she'd learned something else in those 2 months, something she hadn't fully articulated yet. The Vari network was elegant. It was ancient and complex, and it had evolved over more centuries than she could easily conceptualize. And it was built on assumptions so deep they'd stopped being assumptions and become invisible. One of those assumptions was that nothing would ever need to talk back to it. It was a broadcast architecture, a command architecture. Everything flew forward from the hive consensus, and the nodes received and relayed and obeyed. There was no provision for input. The Vari didn't build anything that talked back, because nothing they'd ever encountered had talked back. Mira talked back. She'd already done it with the bypass boxes, and the sensor node spoofing, and the authentication chip. But this was different. She pushed into the transmitter's Vari protocol layer, and, instead of just disabling it or hiding from it, she rewrote the handshake protocol to tell the hive that this sector's scan had already completed and found nothing. Not an absence of signal. A completed successful negative result scan. Full sentence response in the Vari's own language. The pulse cycle came back. The array's resonance nodes lit up. The amber lights blinked 3 times. The sequence the hive used to confirm a sector report, and then went steady green. The hive had accepted her report. The bonded units in the perimeter went dormant. Paya appeared at her shoulder. She looked at the array. She looked at Mira. "What did you just do?" "I lied to them," Mira said. In their own language. There was a pause. "Can they detect that?" "I don't think so. I don't think they've ever built a system to detect it." She met Paya's eyes. They've never had anything to lie to them before. Paya was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "How long does it hold?" "Until something in the hive checks the sector log against an independent visual scan. Maybe an hour, maybe less." Mira stood. "We need to be somewhere else when that happens." From the comms channel, the Meridian's voice came back, clearer now, the atmospheric filter kicking in as the ship repositioned. "Kestrel, we have your signal locked. We are beginning atmospheric entry sequence with escort screen. Estimated ground contact in 42 minutes at extraction vector 279er, your position relative north. Mark the point with your emergency beacon." Mira unclipped the emergency beacon from her vest. She'd carried it for 11 weeks. A small orange cylinder, battered and scratched. Never used because using it would have brought the Vari down on them before any rescue could reach them. She held it in her hand for a moment. It weighed almost nothing. She looked at her squad. They were all looking at her. Hoop and Ern and Earth and Pim, with the unraveled braid and yogurt, leaning on one foot, and Keofrang still in the crawler seat, and Monet eating the last of the foil packet with the same methodical focus she applied to everything. And Paya, with her hand still on the carrot. And every single one of them had been holding a version of this moment in the back of their heads for 11 weeks. The moment when the beacon would become usable, the moment when help could come. She activated it. The light on top turned from dark to white, a steady white pulse. She set it on top of the north pylon, and it sat there, blinking into the gray sky. 42 minutes, she said. They set up a defensive perimeter. That was the right thing to do, and they all knew it. The hive's false negative wouldn't hold indefinitely, and the Meridian would be loud on approach, atmospheric entry being what it was, and the Vari would respond. There would be a window between the escort screen, suppressing the atmospheric grid, and the ground units converging. And the extraction would have to happen inside that window, and that window would not be comfortable. They used 20 of the 42 minutes to position and prepare and check their equipment. In the last 5 minutes before they began to hear the distant sound of the Meridian coming through the cloud layer, Pim came and sat next to Mira in the shadow of the east pylon. She had her braid again. This time she left it alone. "You know what I keep thinking about," she said. "Tell me." "When we were first in Building 7, the first few weeks, I kept thinking there was going to be a moment where someone would explain what we were supposed to do. Like there'd be a plan, and someone would know it, and they'd tell us." She paused. "And then it was just us and we made the plan." Mira looked at her. "That's how it usually goes, is it? Every time I've seen it work." Mira looked up at the sky. There was a light up there, moving through the haze. Not a star, too deliberate, the wrong color. The Meridian dropping through the cloud layer. People think there's someone else with the plan. Then they find out there isn't, and they make one. What if you make the wrong plan? Then you fix it. She thought of the 2 flaws they'd found earlier, Earth's observation and Hoop's, the way the plan had gotten better when she'd let them find the holes. You don't make the plan alone. That's the part people get wrong. You make it together. The sound grew, a deep bass rumble that built slowly from inaudible to felt in the chest. the signature of a heavy vessel forcing atmospheric entry under escort fire. Somewhere to the south there was a flash, the escort screen firing on the atmospheric grid, dropping the Vari AA nodes one by one. Mira could hear the hive pulse cycle stuttering in the resonance nodes around them, the frequency going irregular as nodes went offline. They stood. The meridian came down out of the gray sky, like a building falling upward, enormous and loud and completely real, its landing jets kicking up mineral dust in great spreading curtains. It settled 300 meters north of their position, its ramp already descending. Through the dust, Mira could see figures at the top of the ramp, Alliance Marines in full kit, moving fast, establishing a perimeter. She looked at her squad. "Let's go," she said. They moved. Not running. She'd told them not to run. First rule, don't run. But something that was nearly running, fast and together, across the open ground between the array and the ship, with long strides, Earth and Ern shoulder to shoulder. Pim with her braids still in her hand, Yogurt moving on a bad ankle without complaint. Kaio Frong last off the crawler, Paya still carrying the carrot because she hadn't decided yet whether to leave it. Mira ran rear. She watched them go. She was the last one up the ramp. She could hear the pulse cycle collapsing behind her as the escort screen finished, dismantling the atmospheric grid. Could hear the hive signal going ragged and strange. Peelance. She turned once at the top of the ramp and looked back at the planet. The transmitter array, the gray sky, the ruins of the processing district in the middle distance. The bonded units, dormant now, scattered across the courtyard like dropped toys, still wearing the shapes of people they'd been. She thought about what she'd said. Nothing they'd ever encountered had talked back. She thought, well, now they have. She turned and went inside. The ramp closed, the meridian lifted. In the sealed crew bay, packed and loud with Marines and noise, and the smell of actual food being heated somewhere, Hoop found a ration pack that was still labeled and warm from the ship's heating unit, and she held it in both hands and looked at it for a long time before she ate. Nobody said anything. Nobody needed to. Pim finally finished the braid and let it go.